Okay, we're going to set up first. You'll need your watercolors, water, something to write with. That can be a pen or a pencil, your paintbrush, and I have a little sponge over there as well. Okay, and one of your pieces of watercolor paper. All right, so the first thing I want you to do is at the top of your paper, just write 9 watercolor techniques. And I chose to use a Sharpie just so you all could see what I am doing a little more clearly than if I had used a pencil. And techniques is spelled Techniqueus. Okay. So then when you finish with that, go ahead and divide your paper into 9 sections. So you're going to have 2 lines up and down and 2 lines side to side. No need for them to be perfectly divided, just as long as you have 9 sections. So for the first technique we're going to try is called a wash. Okay, washes are applied with water. So you're going to take your paintbrush, put it in water, and wash your paper to start. Okay, so put plenty of water down there on the surface. Then you're going to take your color and just spread it into the water. Okay, so you're trying to get like a nice even coating of watercolor. Washes are used often in the background of a watercolor painting for like sunrises, sunsets, oceans, anything where you want to get a nice even layer of paint or like a gradation of that watercolor. So blending. Okay, so that's a wash. Technique number 2 is called wet on wet. Okay, so it's similar in that you are going to wet your paper first. Okay, so you're going to put water down just like you did with the wash. Okay. But instead of spreading the color in, you're going to get your brush nice and saturated and you're just going to let the color drop in. Okay, so you kind of let the watercolor do what it wants to do. You're not spreading it around with the brush. And the nice thing about watercolor is that it often, or I would say always actually, looks so much better once it has soaked into the paper and dried a little bit. So you'll get some really neat effects with this wet on wet. You can keep sort of dropping it in until you like what you've gotten. Okay. All right. The third technique we're going to try is moving in another direction. We're going to do wet on dry. Okay, so with this technique, we're not wetting our paper first. And this would be a technique that, I think I'm going to use my pencil. This would be a technique where you wanted to fill in a shape, you wanted to control your watercolor a little bit more. So you've drawn something and you just want to fill it in, okay? So you're going to see that just like that watercolor paper helps to let the color spread when it's wet, it also helps to keep the color contained when it's dry. So you can see as I fill in this circle, even though I have, water on my brush and I have quite a bit of saturation there on the surface, it's still staying contained. It's not, dripping around my paper. Obviously, if I picked it up, it would. But for the most part, it's just staying exactly where I wanted it to. Okay, so try that with a couple of shapes, any shapes that you want. Okay, for technique number 4, we're going to control our brush even more and do a technique called dry brush. Okay, so dry brush is the most controlled use of watercolor. So this is a technique that you want to use for details, textures, patterns, anything where you really want to control the brush, almost like a pencil or a pen. So you see I wipe off all the water. So it's not necessarily dry, but I've wiped it off. And I'm trying to get my brush almost into like a pencil point. And then I put it into the watercolor. Again, trying to get that into a little pencil point. And sometimes it helps if you wet your watercolor palette before. That's what I'm doing. So here I'm going to make almost like some grasses with green. Maybe, let's say I was making like an eye. I was trying to fill in an eye. Again, really trying to control my use of the brush. Okay, any type of texture, pattern. Again, anytime I am trying to really control my use, even if I wanted to write text or something, this would be the technique that I would use. And this would obviously be on top of another technique like wash or wet on wet or wet on dry. You would never do dry brush to start. You would want to do that on top of another layer of watercolor. All right. Just going to add one more. Okay. All right. Technique number 5 is called sponging, which I'm sure many of you have done. So this one might be tricky for you to do. I don't know if you all have a sponge in your house. You could even ball up a little piece of toilet paper or paper towel, okay? But whatever you're using, you want to wet it. If a piece of a sponge is ideal, or even like a loofah from the bathroom. So you're gonna wet it, squeeze it out as best you can, and then you're just putting that right into your watercolor tray. So I'm gonna start with green. So this is a good technique for like foliage, like trees, shrubs, any type of plant. It's a good technique for hair. It's a good technique for sand. Anytime you're trying to get that kind of textural quality that you can layer different colors. So I'm putting some orange since it's fall. Maybe I'll do a little bit of yellow too. Okay. All right. Technique number 6 is another texture technique called salt texture. Okay, so for this one, you are going to want a little container of table salt. Even a salt shaker would work. All right, but the key to this technique is to really have a decent amount of the color pigment, which is like the actual color in the watercolor, sitting on top of the surface. So I'm going to start here with brown. I'm thinking of fall. Maybe I'll put a little bit of red. Okay, so you see I have a decent amount of color pigment sitting on the surface. And then I'm going to take my little container of salt and I just need a little pinch, just like if I was cooking, just a pinch of salt, and I'm going to sprinkle that on. And you'll notice, it might be a little hard to see. Oh no, you can see it. You'll notice that the salt soaks up that color pigment and it almost looks speckled. and you will see that once it dries and you wipe it off, that speckled appearance is left behind. And that technique is also good for foliage, hair, and sand. All right, just like sponging. Okay. All right, so technique number 7, let's do splatter. Okay, now splatter is never flinging your brush around, making a huge mess, especially in your houses, okay? There is a very controlled way of achieving a really good splatter, all right? So there are 2 ways I want you to try. Make sure that you have a decent amount of paint and water on your brush, okay? So your brush is pretty wet with some color on it. The first way is tapping. So tapping your brush will get you kind of a bigger splatter, fatter splatter, okay? And then if you flick your bristles, then you get a finer splatter with smaller, lighter dots, okay? So tapping and flicking, never flinging your brush around. That just creates a mess all over everything. Okay, so sponging, salt texture, splatter, and then finally technique 8 is another texture technique. And it's just using common household item rubbing alcohol. Okay, so just like with salt texture, you want to have a decent amount of the watercolor pigment, like the color pigment, sitting on the surface because the rubbing alcohol has to have something to interact with. I'm going to blend some colors because sometimes you get really interesting effects with this. Okay, so you want just a little container of rubbing alcohol. I'm going to dip my brush in it. Then just like with wet on wet, you can start by just dropping it in and seeing what happens. And you see how the colors kind of start separating and you get this interesting texture. You can also actually apply it like directly to the paper, just see what happens. And when it dries, it looks really, really neat, a different kind of texture. So that's rubbing alcohol. Okay, and number 9 finally is what I call mixed media. And this is just simply mixing materials. Okay, so you can start with colored pencils, you can start with crayons, you can start with markers, and you're just mixing materials. So here I'm going to start with some pencil. Can you see it? Yeah. Maybe I'll use a marker. It needs to be permanent because otherwise if it's water-based, the water will just make it bleed. So you can have patterns, you can have designs, you could have details with colored pencils or crayons, and in that case you would want to put them on top of the watercolor. But since watercolor is transparent, even though I've put that down first on my paper, you can still see that other material coming through. All right. So you can always make a drawing, make patterns, do anything like that, and then the watercolor can go right over them and you can still see that drawing beneath. And as I said, you can also go over top of a watercolor, add details, if you don't feel like you have enough control with the dry brush, you can use a different material. So that is mixed media, mixed materials. So those are your 9 basic watercolor techniques.